Imagine metal in your mouth, not clean metal, not surgical steel, rust-flaked iron, cold from the night air, tasting of copper and old blood, and someone else's saliva dried into the crevices. You feel it press down on your tongue, flat, unyielding, wider than you thought, and then you realize you cannot close your jaw, cannot swallow properly, cannot make a single fucking sound. Now imagine everyone you know watching this happen. Subscribe before we proceed. It will encourage us. Your neighbor who borrowed flour from you last winter. The baker who sold you bread yesterday and smiled. Your cousin, your uncle, your own children brought to the front of the crowd so they could see better, lawing. That's where we're going tonight. No safe distance. No, that was a long time ago. You're going to feel what they felt, or as close as a living body can get without bleeding. 16th century England. A woman, let's call her Agnes, because her real name is long dead and no one bothered to write it down, and she was probably never asked what she wanted to be called anyway. Spoke too loudly at the market. Said something about the magistrate's wife. Maybe the wife was sleeping with a stable boy. Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. Doesn't fucking matter. They came for her that evening. Not police, not soldiers, neighbors, men she'd grown up with. They didn't read her rights. They didn't even tell her what the charge was. They just took her. What they locked onto her head wasn't just a punishment. It was theatre. It was pornography. It was a public announcement that this body no longer belonged to itself. The scold's bridle. Some called it the branks. A cage of iron straps and rusted hinges that locked around the skull like a lover's hands if the lover wanted you dead. Inside, a metal bit, sometimes spiked, sometimes just a flat blade, sometimes shaped like a tongue because the ironworkers had a sense of humour. Slid into the mouth and pinned the tongue down against the floor of the jaw. You couldn't swallow. Drool ran down your chin in thick ropes. Your eyes watered constantly. If you tried to speak, if your tongue so much as twitched, the bit cut deeper. Some versions had spikes on the underside. Some had a bell attached to the top so everyone could hear you coming. They paraded her through the streets with a chain around her waist. Sometimes they tied her to a post in the marketplace and left her there overnight. In winter, children threw mud. Old women spat. Dogs barked at her because she looked wrong, smelled wrong, was wrong now. And men. This is the part the history books get quiet about, the part professors skip in lecture halls. Men touched her, a hand up her skirt, a pinch on her breast. Fingers shoved into her mouth alongside the bit because she couldn't bite, couldn't resist, couldn't say no, couldn't say anything at all. Her body became public property the moment that cage locked shut. Everyone understood this. It wasn't a side effect. It was the whole point. Silence her mouth, own her body. That's the transaction. Think about what that does to a mind over 6 hours, over 12, over a full day and night. Not just the pain, the certainty, the absolute soul-crushing knowledge that your community, people you've known since birth, people whose children you've babysat, whose sick mothers you've nursed, will pay money for a better view, will bring their children and lift them up so they can see properly. We'll go home afterward and have dinner and sleep and wake up and do it again tomorrow if you're still there. Some women went mad in the bridal. Some never spoke again even after it was removed. Some developed infections from the cuts in their mouths and died of sepsis. Weeks later, their tongues black and swollen. Their last hours spent making sounds that weren't words. But the bridal was almost gentle compared to what waited across the continent. A shrew. That's what they called her. A woman who argued. Who refused to lower her eyes when her husband spoke. Who maybe, just maybe, told him to go fuck himself when he raised his hand to her. Who had opinions. Who laughed too loud. Who existed in a way that made men uncomfortable. For women like that, they built the shrew's fiddle. Picture a violin made for a giant. 2 heavy oak boards with holes carved for neck and wrists. No sanding. No finish. The wood was left rough so it would scrape. When they closed it around her, her head was locked forward, chin up, hands trapped near her face like she was praying or begging. She couldn't feed herself, couldn't wipe her own mouth, couldn't scratch an itch. If a fly landed on her eye, she had to let it walk. If she stumbled, she couldn't break her fall. Face first into cobblestones, nose broken, teeth cracked, still locked in the wood, she'd stand in the square for hours, sometimes days. Piss running down her legs, soaking into her skirt, the smell of ammonia and fear rising around her. Menstrual blood crusting on her thighs because no one was going to help her manage that. The smell of her own body becoming part of the punishment, part of the spectacle. And the crowd would walk past. Some would mock, some would whisper prayers. Some would leave food just out of reach, so they could watch her strain toward it. Almost none would help, because helping meant you might be next. Helping meant you sympathized, and sympathy for a shrew meant you were probably a shrew yourself. But here's what nobody tells you about the fiddle. Sometimes they'd lock two people in together, face to face, inches apart. Think about that. Two women who'd been fighting over a property line. Or a husband and wife who couldn't stop screaming at each other, locked face to face in the same wooden trap, forced to stare into each other's eyes while the crowd circled, forced to smell each other's fear sweet, each other's sour breath, each other's slow decay, forced to hear each other's stomachs growl, forced to watch each other break. How long before hatred became something else? Before the shared humiliation did something stranger to them than the punishment ever could? Did they start talking, whispering, planning? Did they fall in love? Did one of them kill the other the moment they were freed? I don't know. Neither do the records. They never cared enough to write that part down. The interior lives of punished women were not considered historically significant. Now let's go. Somewhere wetter. Somewhere the punishment wasn't just about pain or shame, but about the edge between living and drowning. The ducking stool, they'd strap her in. Always a her, almost always a her, the records are unambiguous on this, and wheel her through town first. Let everyone see. Let everyone throw whatever they had, rotten vegetables crawling with maggots, dead cats bloated with decay, stones if the mood was right, and the mood was often right. Once, a woman had a chamber pot emptied over her head before she even reached the river. The crowd roared, then they'd roll her to the water's edge. And here's where it gets medically, viscerally obscene. The beam would lift. The chair would swing out over the water, creaking, the wood groaning under her weight. She'd see the river below her, brown, cold, full of things she couldn't name. And then, they'd drop her. The water in these rivers wasn't clean. It was shit and tannery runoff, and rotting fish and dead dogs, and everything the town wanted to forget, flowing past. It filled her mouth, her nose, her lungs. She'd thrash against the leather restraints, muscles tearing, wrists bleeding. The crowd would count. Sometimes 10 seconds, sometimes 30, sometimes long enough for the struggling to slow down, for the bubbles to stop, for the body to go limp. Then they'd pull her up, gasping, vomiting river filth, snot and blood and brown water streaming from every hole in her face. Eyes wild, unfocused, animal. Some women shit themselves from the terror. The crowd laughed harder, and then they'd do it again, and again, and again. Some women died during the ducking. Heart failure from the cold shock. Drowning when the restraints held them under too long. Hypothermia that set in hours later and killed them in their beds, still wet, still shaking. When they died, the authorities called it proof of innocence. God had taken their pure souls. When they survived, it meant God was not protecting them because they were guilty. Their survival was evidence of their crime. Dead but innocent, living but guilty. Choose your verdict. Wait, stop. Think about that logic for a second. Really think. The test was designed so that both outcomes proved the accusation. If you died, you were innocent and dead. If you lived, you were guilty and would be punished further. There was no winning. There was no passing. The outcome was predetermined. The suffering was the point. The water was just the method. That's not justice. That's a death cult wearing the mask of law. That's torture with paperwork. Let's move somewhere darker now. Somewhere the punishment didn't end when the crowd went home. Somewhere the mark was permanent, visible, impossible to hide, because some scars don't fade. Some scars are designed not to. In Puritan New England, and in parts of Scotland, and in Calvin's Geneva, and in any place where men read the Bible and saw themselves as God's deputies. They had a different approach to women who broke the marriage contract. Adulteresses. Say the word out loud. Wherever you are, feel how it tastes. Adulteress, 4 syllables. The feminine ending makes it dirtier somehow, doesn't it? A man was an adulterer, clinical, almost formal, a word for courtrooms. But an adulteress? That word was a spit. That word was a hand grabbing your wrist too hard. That word was permission. In Massachusetts Bay Colony, they didn't always hang adulteresses. Hanging was too quick, too merciful, too private, in its way, a few minutes of strangling or a broken neck and then nothing. Where was the lesson in that? Instead, they'd sew a letter onto her clothing. Red cloth, wool, so it scratched. The letter A, and she would wear it for the rest of her natural life. Every time she bought bread, the baker saw it and might refuse to serve her. Every time she prayed, the congregation saw it and might ask her to leave. Every time a man looked at her, and men always looked, he knew what she'd been accused of. And what men do with that knowledge, what men feel entitled to do to a woman who's already been labelled unchaste, is a chapter these towns never wrote down in official records, but every woman understood in her bones. But the letter was the soft version. The letter was mercy. The hard version was branding, a hot iron, heated in public, in front of the crowd, so everyone could hear the coals hissing, so everyone could smell the metal getting ready. Pressed into the skin of the cheek, or the forehead. Can't hide that. Can't cover that with a scarf without raising questions. Or the palm of the hand, so every handshake for the rest of her life would be an accusation. So every time she reached for something, she'd see it. So every time she touched herself, she'd feel it. The smell of burning human skin is something you never forget if you've smelled it once. Sweet and savoury at the same time. Like pork, people say, and then they feel sick for saying it. The women who performed the branding, and sometimes it was other women holding the iron, sometimes it was the victim's own mother, forced to do it to prove her loyalty, said the worst part wasn't the sound, it was the silence after. The moment the branded woman looked down at her own seared flesh, the blisters already rising, the skin already curling back from the wound, and understood, this is forever. This is my face now. This is who I am until I die. Some women tried to hide it, covered their faces with thick scarves even in summer, kept their branded hands in their pockets, in gloves, behind their backs, developed a permanent stoop to keep their faces in shadow, but the community policed that too. Hiding the mark was a second crime. Concealing punishment was itself punishable. Neighbours reported neighbours. Children were encouraged to look for hidden brands and tell the constable, you wear what they did to you, forever. That's the entire point. Now we go somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the logic bends. Somewhere the accusation itself is impossible to disprove because the crime doesn't exist. Because everything I've described so far, the bridle, the stool, the fiddle, the brand, was still, in some perverse and corrupted way, about punishment fitting an accusation. A charge was named. A sentence was carried out. However unfairly, however brutally, there was at least a pretense of law. But what happens when there's no crime at all? When the accusation itself is invisible, supernatural, pulled from nightmares and old wives' tales and the fever dreams of celibate men? What happens when they come for you because of a mole on your inner thigh? The witch hunts, between roughly 1450 and 1750, 300 years, longer than the United States has existed. Somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe and the American colonies. Some estimates go higher, much higher. The records aren't complete because in many places, The records were burned along with the bodies. Roughly 75 to 80% of the executed were women. Let that number sit in your chest for a moment. 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5. And before you think, mass hysteria, superstition, people didn't know better. Stop. That's too easy. That's the comfortable story we tell ourselves so we can feel safely distant from it. That lets the killers off the hook. The witch hunts were organized. They were legal. They were documented in meticulous detail. And they were profitable. Witch hunters charged fees. Per diem, per test, per execution. Towns confiscated the property of the convicted. The church and the courts split the spoils according to formulas written down in law books. There were invoices, receipts, expense reports. Item, 3 pounds of iron for leg shackles. Item, payment to executioner for strangulation prior to burning. Item, firewood, premium grade, for efficient combustion.